All-time high for youth First Nation suicide. Presentation by Megan McConnell. During the summer of 2019, 22 attempted suicides took place in the God's Lake First Nation community, a First Nations government whose reservation is situated in northern Manitoba. The government declared a state of emergency after 4 young people died. Many of the members of the community attribute these deaths to a blatant cry for help. These tragedies provide an illustration of the Canadian government's failed policies, laws, and services. Weeks after her partner committed suicide, Desiree, pictured on the right, died of a broken heart. Due to the lack of appropriate government support, Desiree is among the First Nations youth suffering within God's Lake community. Many have proposed to enact Bill C-262, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as a solution to this crisis. Bill C-262 guarantees that laws and policies of Canada are aligned with the right of First Nations self-government. Nevertheless, the Senate ended the session and destroyed such bills' chances of passing. According to Statistics Canada, youth-related suicide deaths in the First Nations community are more than 3 times the national average. By examining the pooling from 2011 to 2016, non-Indigenous hold a suicide rate of 8 deaths per 100,000. This is in comparison to 24.3 deaths of self-identifying Indigenous and 14.7 deaths per 100,000 peoples at risk for Métis. Most alarmingly is the suicide rate for those self-identifying as Inuit, with a rate of 72.3 deaths per 100,000 people at risk. The alarming statistics of suicide rates among First Nations youth are a direct consequence of First Nations historical context. The effects of forced assimilation policies on colonization continue to cause severe stress among these communities. An estimated 150,000 children attended residential schools, where these schools brought forward students to excessive punishment and both physical and sexual abuse. Overall, these destructive experiences in these residential schools has resulted in long-lasting effects within generations of First Nations. In addition to the rapid cultural loss in these communities, many people have lost a sense of who they are and what they belong to. Many First Nations suffered a denial of existence as human beings, corroding the values of their traditions, stability of their families, and cultural practices. Much of this stress expresses through these populations' feelings of a sense of marginality, depression, and identity uncertainty. Finally, socioeconomic characteristics, including low household income, educational levels, and reserve life, can all be identified as risk factors that make a person more likely to commit suicide. Following social sociologist Emily Durkheim's ideas, he suggests that when governments struggle to provide a moral guidance, a sense of anonymity exists. As a result, people are completely unable to integrate into the social world. The study by Durkheim adequately reflects how First Nations people are unable to integrate because of the permanent economic barriers that led to the inability to develop. Communities of First Nations are subject to carved design obstacles that need to be recognized. There are both physical and social obstacles present. Such physical barriers include remote location of Aboriginal communities, inadequate infrastructure, which can result in high transportation services, and a lack of marketable capital. The social barriers, on the other hand, include harmful policies of assimilation, weak education services, and an ongoing discrimination that hinders proper development. It is therefore necessary to recognize and renovate the usable land, local decision-making, and functioning rules and systems. Land ownership for Indigenous people continues to be an important factor in limiting Indigenous economic development and acts as a factor in stress. Since many Indigenous peoples live on reserves, there are more restrictions present on these lands. Reserve lands are subject to remote locations with insufficient infrastructure, which impedes on investment growth or private interest. In addition, the Crown legally owns reserve lands, which limits First Nations' ability to make decisions about their lands and makes the ultimate decision maker unclear. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 protects Indigenous peoples' right to their lands and prohibits the conquest of Aboriginal property. Despite its efforts, the Royal Proclamation is an ambiguous document, as the document affirms the Crown the absolute ownership of Indigenous title, granting the right to non-community members. As a result, the proclamation further limits Indigenous peoples' right to self-governments. Indigenous self-governments is the structure that controls the management of their land, resources, and programs and policies by Indigenous communities. Self-governance is understood as a solution to lower rates of suicide and despair among these communities. Conditions that can assist in facilitating a healthy environment for these members include control over areas such as land, education, police, and health services. The community members who directly understand the social context are best to undertake suicide prevention, recognizing the responsibility remains within the community as a whole. Indigenous law includes both the legal traditions and legal orders of Indigenous people themselves. Indigenous legislation has recognized to its community the strength of Indigenous legal practices and that Canada's contribution as a whole is essential to reconciliation. The Indian Act allowed the Canadian government to assert dominance on all aspects of Indigenous life. Yet gradually, during the 1980s and 1990s, the government began to recognize Indigenous right to self-governance. While the transformations are notable, most First Nations remain under oppressive governance in Canada. Consequently, it's highly important for Canada's criminal and social justice systems to recognize the right of Indigenous jurisdictions. By analyzing the case of Indigenous suicide among youth in the God's Lake First Nation, a widespread social disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is evident. In order to address these issues properly, individuals, societies, and organizations need to work harmoniously. The Canadian governments must provide more support to help these Indigenous youth in distress. This case study has illustrated how Canada's law system has interfered among Indigenous law, and moving forward, it'll be interesting to see how the Canadian system will accommodate to such mandates.